The Carter family was old money. Ryan's father, Richard Carter, was a 55-year-old respected attorney who carried himself with gravitas. A widower, Richard had raised Ryan alone after his wife died in a car accident when Ryan was 10. He was admired in public, but at home, Richard was distant, cold, and controlling. Few knew of the double life Richard led, one of secrets, manipulation, and carefully buried indiscretions. As Emily spent more time with the Carters planning the wedding, Richard's attention toward her grew unsettling. He complimented her often, lingered in conversations, and began making subtle flirtations. At first, Emily brushed it off as innocent admiration, but there was something intense in Richard's eyes, a hunger that unsettled her. Still, the excitement of wedding preparations overshadowed her unease. Emily's mother had abandoned her when she was a teen, and her father was emotionally unavailable. She longed for stability, validation, and to feel desired. Richard, with his confident demeanor and sharp intellect, offered a kind of attention that both flattered and confused her. He played into her emotional voids, presenting himself as understanding and worldly. One night after a family dinner, Richard offered to drive Emily home while Ryan stayed behind with friends. In the car, he spoke softly about how special she was, how Ryan didn't deserve her. When they reached her apartment, Richard leaned in and kissed her. Shocked and overwhelmed, Emily didn't stop him. That night marked the beginning of a dangerous affair. Emily was racked with guilt, but drawn to the thrill. Richard texted her secretively, arranged meetings under the guise of wedding errands, and promised that no one would ever know. Emily justified the affair as a temporary lapse, one she would end soon, but each encounter pulled her deeper into his web. Ryan, sensing Emily's growing distance, began to ask questions. He noticed her phone was always locked, and her excuses felt rehearsed. But his love for her overpowered his doubt. He wanted to believe in their future. Emily, meanwhile, grew more paranoid, terrified of getting caught. Behind the charm, Richard was a predator. He thrived on control and secrecy. Years earlier, he had hidden an HIV diagnosis from his partners. He refused to acknowledge the gravity of his condition, claiming medication kept it under control, and that disclosure was unnecessary. Emily was unaware of any of this. Months into the affair, Emily started experiencing unusual fatigue and recurrent fevers. Thinking it was just stress, she delayed seeing a doctor. But as symptoms worsened, she underwent testing. The results shattered her world. She was HIV positive. Confused and terrified, she immediately thought of Ryan. Emily convinced Ryan to do a HIV test without telling him about her recent diagnosis. He was negative. That's when it hit her. Emily confronted Richard in private. He didn't deny it. Instead, he coldly told her that no one would believe her and that exposing him would destroy Ryan and the wedding. Emily was horrified, realizing the man she had trusted was far more sinister than she ever imagined. She began to withdraw, trying to figure out what to do. Richard warned Emily that if she exposed him, he'd ruin her. He had photos, messages, and even surveillance footage from hidden cameras. He had anticipated this fallout and was prepared to control it. Emily felt trapped. She couldn't go to Ryan, couldn't tell anyone. The walls were closing in. Emily confided in her best friend, Maya, without naming Richard. She hinted that someone older, powerful, and connected had hurt her. Maya urged her to cancel the wedding and leave town. Emily began researching new jobs in another state, hoping to disappear quietly before things got worse. Emily began documenting everything, every encounter, every conversation, her medical records, and emotional reflections. She hid the diary in her apartment, intending to use it later if needed. It was her only safety net, her only proof. With the wedding weeks away, Emily felt suffocated. She pretended everything was fine while planning her escape. Richard sensed her slipping away and tightened his grip, calling more often, threatening exposure, reminding her that her life was in his hands. 3 days before the wedding, Richard asked to meet. Emily agreed, thinking she'd record the conversation as evidence. They met at his office after hours. She wore a hidden recorder and pressed him for answers. He admitted to everything, his condition, his manipulation, and his reasons. He said he couldn't let his son know. That was the final straw. That night, Emily didn't come home. Her phone went dead. Ryan called everyone. No one had seen her. The next day, her car was found abandoned. Her body, wrapped in plastic, was discovered near the river 2 days later. Blunt force trauma to the head. Police were baffled. Ryan was devastated. Detectives initially suspected Ryan, but soon Maya came forward with Emily's diary. Investigators discovered the affair with a man referred to as R and recordings from the hidden recorder. They traced the meeting to Richard's office. DNA from Emily's fingernails matched Richard. Security footage confirmed he was the last person to see her alive. Under pressure, Richard maintained innocence, claiming Emily was obsessed and mentally unstable. But the evidence was mounting. Police arrested Richard Carter. The community was stunned. A respected attorney accused of murdering his future daughter-in-law. Ryan was inconsolable. When he learned of the affair and HIV diagnosis, his world shattered completely. Police, continuing to comb through Richard's properties, discovered a locked safe at his lake house. Inside were dozens of photos, videos, and letters, evidence of a double life. Some of the material included compromising photos of Emily, taken without her knowledge. It became clear Richard had been documenting his secret affairs for years. Among Emily's belongings, detectives found sealed letters addressed to Ryan, Maya, and even Richard. In them, she poured out her heart, her remorse, her fear, her love, and her regrets. Ryan's letter revealed she had planned to tell him the truth and call off the wedding the day after she met Richard for the last time. With overwhelming evidence and damning testimony, Richard's defense team struggled to maintain credibility. The narrative of Emily as unstable collapsed under the weight of physical proof and multiple corroborating witnesses. The trial became national news. Prosecutors painted Richard as a manipulative predator who exploited and silenced a woman to protect his image. The diary, medical records, and voice recording were damning. Richard's defense team argued mental instability and emotional provocation. When Ryan took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. He spoke of his love for Emily, the plans they had made, and the betrayal he felt from both his fiancé and father. His voice cracked as he read a note Emily had written to him but never delivered, found folded inside her diary. Maya recounted the secret conversations, Emily's growing fear, and the day she confided about an older man hurting her. She described how Emily had planned to leave and how terrified she was of the consequences. Her testimony drew tears from the gallery. After a tense deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Richard Carter was convicted of first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and knowingly transmitting HIV without disclosure. The courtroom erupted in emotion, relief, grief, and anger. Emily's story sparked national conversations about consent, disclosure of medical conditions, and abuse of power. Ryan, shattered and betrayed, took time away from his career. Maya launched a foundation in Emily's name, dedicated to supporting victims of coercion and abuse. The town of Meadowbrook would never forget the tragedy behind the picture-perfect engagement. Ryan fell into a deep depression. He couldn't reconcile the woman he loved with the betrayal she kept hidden, or the fact that his own father was her killer. He withdrew from family and friends, battling insomnia, anger, and guilt. Some blamed Emily, others blamed Ryan for being blind to it all. He blamed himself for not seeing the signs. The community of Meadowbrook erupted. Candlelight vigils were held for Emily. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse demanding harsher penalties for non-disclosure of HIV status. Richard's law firm was disbanded, and every case he had worked on came under scrutiny. Former mistresses came forward anonymously, suggesting Emily wasn't his first target, only the first who died. Ryan checked himself into a rehabilitation center after a panic attack nearly sent him into cardiac arrest. He knew he needed to confront his pain before it consumed him. While many sympathized with Ryan and Emily, others whispered behind closed doors, blaming Emily for her choices. She knew what she was doing, some said. She broke the family apart. Others defended her, citing Richard's power and manipulation. The town was split, forced to examine uncomfortable truths about gender, power, and secrecy. From prison, Richard attempted to appeal the conviction, claiming prosecutorial misconduct and unfair media bias. His appeal was swiftly denied. But the attempt stirred trauma in Ryan, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. He publicly condemned his father for trying to escape justice. Maya, now a fierce advocate, began speaking at women's shelters and colleges. She shared Emily's story, not to shame, but to warn. She worked with legal teams to lobby for legislation requiring disclosure of certain medical conditions and expanding protections for victims of emotional coercion and psychological abuse. Emily's diagnosis forced the community to confront a topic often shrouded in stigma. Local clinics saw an increase in testing. Schools began offering more comprehensive sexual education. Ryan, once private and withdrawn, began working with advocacy groups to fight misinformation and promote early testing and treatment. With Richard behind bars and the scandal public, the Carter family name lost its prestige. Business partners severed ties. Relatives changed their last names. Ryan sold the family home and donated the proceeds to Maya's foundation. He wanted nothing that tied him to the man who destroyed his life. Months later, Ryan returned to the place where he proposed to Emily, a quiet park bench near the lake. He sat in silence, holding a copy of her letter. He didn't cry this time. He simply whispered, "I forgive you," into the wind. It was the first step forward. The Emily Jensen Legacy Foundation opened its first outreach center. It provided counseling, emergency housing, and legal aid for those trapped in coercive or dangerous relationships. Her story, once a tragedy, had become a lifeline for others. On the anniversary of Emily's death, Maya hosted a memorial service. Dozens attended, survivors, advocates, even former patients of Emily's from the hospital. Ryan spoke for the first time in public, sharing how her memory was a light in his darkest moments. In prison, Richard became a target. Fellow inmates despised his crime, especially his history of using power to exploit women. He was attacked multiple times, eventually placed in solitary confinement for his own protection. His health declined, and he refused treatment, convinced the world had wronged him. A journalist secured one final interview with Richard. When asked if he regretted anything, Richard sneered. "I regret trusting the wrong woman. That's it." It was the last public statement he ever made. The world saw him for what he was, unrepentant, broken, and dangerous. Ryan left Meadowbrook and moved to Seattle, where no one knew his story. He changed careers, working as a trauma counselor for teens. Every day, he carried Emily's picture in his wallet. She was both a wound and a reminder. Love can be real, and so can deception. Maya wrote a memoir titled Her Name Was Emily, a story of secrets, power, and silence. The book became a bestseller, praised for its honesty and emotional depth. It wasn't just about Emily's death. It was about every woman who'd been silenced by someone stronger. Thanks to Maya's advocacy and public pressure, the state passed Emily's Law, a legal requirement that individuals with communicable diseases disclose their status to sexual partners with criminal penalties for concealment. The law sparked national debate, but stood as a landmark victory for victims. Inside a hidden file on Emily's laptop, Maya found a letter Emily wrote to her future self. It read, "If I make it out of this, I want to become someone brave, someone who helps others like me. If I don't, please tell my story, not to shame me, but so no one else ends up silent." Despite everything, Ryan held on to one truth. His love for Emily had been real. The lies, the betrayal, it all hurt. But the way she laughed, the way she held his hand, the kindness in her, those were real. And nothing Richard did could erase that. Following the trial, 3 women, anonymous, came forward claiming Richard had infected them as well, using similar manipulation. Their testimonies weren't admissible during the trial, but became crucial in highlighting the scale of Richard's deceit. The pattern was undeniable. Emily had briefly seen a therapist during the final months of her life. In the notes, the therapist described Emily as haunted by shame, but desperate to do the right thing. She had been trying to find a way out. Her death wasn't weakness, it was sabotage. The hospital where Emily worked named a new wing after her, the Emily Jensen Center for Women's Health. Former patients shared stories of how she saved their lives, comforted them, and made them feel safe. Her legacy, unlike her fate, was full of light. At her gravesite, Maya and Ryan stood side by side. No words were needed, just tears, hands held tightly, and a bouquet of sunflowers, Emily's favorite. They promised her story would never be forgotten. Emily Jensen was not perfect. She was flawed, fragile, and human, but she didn't deserve to die. Her story is a warning and a legacy. In a world of secrets, her truth screamed louder than silence. And in that truth, others found the strength to speak.